Nolan Hayes walked into an upscale Seattle restaurant, expecting an awkward blind date he could endure and forget. Instead, he locked eyes with Sabrina Cole, the CEO of his company, the woman who could fire him with a single word. In that instant, a harmless dinner became a professional catastrophe neither of them saw coming. If you want to see how a blind date turned into a career-threatening scandal, stay with me until the end. And don't forget to hit that like button and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The restaurant was the kind of place Nolan Hayes would never pick for himself. Too much polished wood, too much soft lighting that made everyone look like they belonged in a cologne ad. He stood just inside the entrance, tugging at the collar of his shirt, wondering why he'd let Marcus talk him into this. "You need to get back out there," Marcus had said 3 days ago, leaning against Nolan's desk at work with that infuriating grin. "It's been 2 years, man. 2 years since Rachel left. You can't just hide behind Ethan forever." Nolan had wanted to argue that he wasn't hiding behind his son. He was raising him. There was a difference. But Marcus had already moved on, scrolling through his phone with the focused determination of a man on a mission. "I know someone perfect for you," Marcus had continued. "Smart, successful, actually has her life together. Not like that disaster from accounting you went out with last year." "I didn't go out with anyone from accounting." Is exactly my point. You don't go out with anyone. That's the problem. So here Nolan was, standing in a restaurant that probably charged $20 for a salad, waiting for a woman whose name he'd already forgotten. Sarah? Sandra? Marcus had told him, but Nolan had been distracted by Ethan's math homework at the time, and now the name had slipped away entirely. The hostess approached with a smile that looked expensive. "Can I help you?" "I'm meeting someone. A blind date, actually." He felt stupid saying it out loud. "Name? Mine or hers?" The hostess's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes suggested this wasn't the first time she'd dealt with a blind date gone awkward before it even started. "Let's start with yours." "Nolan Hayes." She glanced down at her tablet, then looked back up. "Right this way." He followed her through the restaurant, past tables full of people who looked comfortable in places like this. Men in suits that fit properly. Women in dresses that probably cost more than Nolan's monthly rent. He tried not to think about the fact that he was wearing the same jacket he'd worn to his cousin's wedding 3 years ago, or that there was probably still a small stain on the sleeve from where Ethan had spilled grape juice during the reception. The hostess stopped at a table near the window. "Here we are." And that's when Nolan's entire world tilted sideways. The woman sitting at the table looked up, and for a moment neither of them moved. Nolan felt his stomach drop like he'd just missed the last step on a staircase. Sabrina Cole. Not Sarah. Not Sandra. Sabrina fucking Cole, the CEO of the company where he worked. The woman who ran quarterly meetings with the warmth of a January morning. The woman who'd once sent back a project proposal with so many red ink corrections that it looked like someone had been murdered on the page. She was staring at him with the same expression he imagined was on his own face. Pure, undiluted horror. "Mr. Hayes," she said, and her voice had that same clipped precision it always did in meetings. "Ms. Cole." He couldn't move. His feet had apparently decided they no longer took orders from his brain. The hostess, blissfully unaware of the disaster unfolding in front of her, gestured to the empty chair. "Enjoy your evening." She left, and Nolan and Sabrina continued to stare at each other across the table like two people who just realized they were standing in a minefield. "This is a mistake," Sabrina said finally. "Yeah." Nolan's voice came out rough. "Big one. We should leave." "Agreed." Neither of them moved. Sabrina's fingers drummed against the table, a nervous gesture that Nolan had never seen from her before. At work, she was always controlled, always composed. Seeing her ruffled was like watching a statue suddenly remember it used to be human. "If we both leave right now," she said slowly, "Marcus and Claire are going to know something went wrong." Nolan blinked. "Claire set you up too?" "My assistant. She's been on this crusade to improve my work-life balance." Sabrina's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Apparently, I need to open myself up to new experiences. Marcus used almost the exact same words. They looked at each other again, and Nolan saw something shift in Sabrina's expression. Not quite amusement, but close to it. The kind of dark humor that comes from realizing you're trapped in a situation so absurd that anger would be a waste of energy. They planned this, Sabrina said. You think? Marcus works in your department. Claire sits 10 feet from my office. They've met. Nolan sank into the chair across from her, suddenly too tired to keep standing. So what do we do? We could stay. Sabrina's tone suggested she was testing the idea as she said it. Have one drink, maybe an appetizer. Make it look like we tried. Then we leave, tell them it didn't work out, and never speak of this again. It wasn't a terrible plan. If they both left immediately, Marcus would ask questions. Worse, he'd probably try to set Nolan up again, convinced that the first attempt had just been bad timing. At least if they stayed for 30 minutes, they could claim they'd given it a fair shot. One drink, Nolan said, and we never mention this to anyone at work. Obviously, a waiter appeared at their table with impeccable timing, as if he'd been waiting in the wings for the exact moment the tension became unbearable. Good evening. Can I start you off with something to drink? Sabrina didn't hesitate. Whiskey? Neat. The waiter turned to Nolan, who was still processing the fact that his CEO drank whiskey like someone who meant it. Same. When the waiter left, silence settled over the table again. Nolan tried to think of something to say that wouldn't make things worse, but everything that came to mind felt either too personal or too professional. He couldn't ask about work. That would defeat the entire purpose of pretending this was a normal date. But he couldn't ask about her personal life either, because he was her employee, and that would be wildly inappropriate. Your son is 7, right? Sabrina said suddenly. Nolan looked up, surprised. You know about Ethan? I know about everyone who works for me, or at least the important details. She paused. That came out wrong. I meant I make it a point to know my employees beyond just their job titles. Right. Nolan wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unnerved. Yeah, he just turned 7 last month. Marcus mentioned you're raising him alone. There it was. The question that always came up eventually, usually phrased more delicately. Nolan had learned to deliver the answer quickly, like ripping off a bandage. His mom left about 2 years ago, decided parenthood wasn't for her after all. He expected sympathy, or worse, pity. Instead, Sabrina just nodded like he'd told her something practical and unsurprising. That must be difficult. Some days more than others. The waiter returned with their drinks, and Nolan grabbed his glass maybe a little too quickly. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn. The kind that reminded him he was still capable of feeling something other than chronic exhaustion. Do you have kids? He asked, then immediately regretted it. Too personal. Way too personal. But Sabrina didn't seem offended. No, I've been too focused on work. And now I'm 30 and realizing that might have been a mistake. She took a drink, her expression unreadable. Claire thinks I'm going to wake up at 40 and regret not having a personal life. Is she right? Maybe. Sabrina set her glass down carefully. I built the company from nothing, took it from a startup in my garage to something real. That took everything I had. There wasn't room for anything else. Nolan studied her across the table. At work, Sabrina Cole was intimidating. Sharp suits, sharper words, the kind of presence that made people straighten their spines when she walked into a room. But sitting here, with her guard slightly lowered, she just looked tired. The kind of tired that came from carrying too much for too long. I get that, he said. After Rachel left, it was just me and Ethan. I couldn't afford to fall apart, so I didn't. Just kept moving forward. Does it get easier? Not really, you just get better at faking it. Sabrina laughed, and the sound caught Nolan off guard. It wasn't the polite professional laugh she used in meetings. It was real. A little rough around the edges, like she was out of practice. I'm not sure this counts as appropriate first date conversation, she said. Probably not, but then again, this isn't really a date. No, it's definitely not. They ordered food because leaving after one drink would have been too obvious, and because neither of them had eaten dinner yet. The conversation stayed carefully neutral after that. They talked about Seattle, about the restaurant, about safe topics that wouldn't remind them they were boss and employee sitting across from each other in a situation that could get them both in serious trouble if anyone found out. But then Sabrina mentioned something about a fundraiser, and Nolan's attention sharpened. Wait, the youth center on Morrison Street? You know it? I volunteer there, teaching coding to teenagers on weekends. Sabrina set down her fork. You're one of the mentors? For about a year now. I figured if I was going to spend my weekends away from Ethan, it should be for something that mattered. I'm on the board, Sabrina said slowly, and a major donor. I've been trying to expand the programs, get more mentors involved. You funded the new computer lab. You've seen it? I teach in it every Saturday. For the first time since Nolan had sat down, the tension between them shifted into something that wasn't quite comfort, but close. They started talking about the center, about the kids, about the programs that worked and the ones that needed improvement. Sabrina had ideas, big, ambitious ideas that required funding and coordination. Nolan had ground-level perspective, stories about specific students, and what they actually needed versus what the board thought they needed. There's a girl in my class, Pachi, Nolan said, leaning forward without realizing it. Keisha. She's 14 and already better at Python than half the developers I work with. But her family can't afford a computer at home, so she's stuck using the library or waiting for lab time at the center. What does she need? A laptop, something decent enough to practice on. But those aren't cheap, and her mom's working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Sabrina pulled out her phone, typed something quickly, then set it back down. I'll have one delivered to the center by Monday. Make sure Keisha gets it. Nolan stared at her. Just like that? That's what the fund is for. I don't need another tax write-off. I need kids like Keisha to have a real shot. You're not what I expected. Neither are you. The waiter came back to clear their plates, and Nolan realized with some surprise that over an hour had passed. The restaurant had filled up around them, the low hum of conversation and clinking silverware, creating a kind of background noise that made their table feel like its own small world. We should probably go, Sabrina said, but she didn't move. Yeah. They sat there for another moment, neither of them quite ready to break whatever strange thing had happened over the course of the meal. It wasn't romance. Nolan wasn't stupid enough to think this was heading anywhere it shouldn't, but it was connection, and that was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Finally, Sabrina stood, and Nolan followed. They walked to the front of the restaurant in silence, both reaching for their wallets at the same time. I'll get it, Nolan said. That's not necessary. I know, but I'm going to anyway. Sabrina looked like she wanted to argue, but then she just nodded. Thank you. Outside, the Seattle night was cool and damp, the kind of weather that made Nolan glad he'd brought a jacket, even if it was old and stained. They stood on the sidewalk, and Nolan realized he had no idea how to end this. He started. Sabrina echoed. This was weird. Extremely. But not terrible. She smiled, and it was a real smile. Small, but genuine. No, not terrible. We're never going to talk about this again, right? Absolutely not. Good. Sabrina's car pulled up, because of course she had a car service, and she paused before getting in. Nolan? Yeah? I meant what I said about the laptop. I'll make sure Keisha gets it. I know you will. She got into the car, and Nolan watched it pull away before heading to his own beat-up sedan parked 3 blocks away because he'd been too cheap to pay for closer parking. The drive home was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He kept replaying the evening, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out how a disaster had turned into something that felt almost like the start of a friendship. But friendship wasn't the right word either, because friends didn't have the kind of power imbalance that he and Sabrina had. She was his boss. He was her employee. There were lines, clear ones, and tonight had already pushed them further than was smart. By the time he got home, Mrs. Chen from next door was asleep on his couch with the TV on low. Ethan was in bed, his small body curled around a stuffed dinosaur that had seen better days. Nolan paid Mrs. Chen, thanked her, and waited until she left before collapsing into the chair by Ethan's bed. Hey, buddy, he whispered, even though Ethan was dead asleep. His son didn't answer, just shifted slightly and kept breathing in that deep, even rhythm that meant he was completely out. Nolan sat there for a long time, watching Ethan sleep and thinking about the woman who'd just bought a laptop for a kid she'd never met, about the way she'd laughed when he'd made that stupid joke about faking it, about the fact that he couldn't stop thinking about her and how dangerous that was. He should forget about tonight, pretend it never happened. Go back to work on Monday and treat Sabrina Cole exactly the way he always had, with professional respect and careful distance. That was the smart thing to do. But as Nolan finally dragged himself to his own bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that forgetting Sabrina Cole was going to be a lot harder than it should be. Monday morning hit Nolan like a truck he should have seen coming, but somehow didn't. He'd spent the entire weekend trying to convince himself that Friday night hadn't meant anything, that he could walk into the office and treat Sabrina Cole like she was still just his CEO and nothing more. He'd almost succeeded. Then he saw her in the hallway. She was walking toward the executive wing with her assistant Claire, talking about something that required the kind of sharp hand gestures Sabrina used when she was solving a problem in real time. She looked exactly like she always did, tailored black suit, hair pulled back, the kind of focused energy that made everyone around her move a little faster. But Nolan couldn't stop seeing the woman from Friday night, the one who'd laughed at his terrible joke and promised a laptop to a kid she'd never met. Their eyes met for maybe half a second. Sabrina's expression didn't change at all, and then she was past him, still talking to Claire like Nolan was just another employee she'd walked by in the hall, which was exactly what he was supposed to be. "Dude, you look like hell," Marcus said, appearing at Nolan's elbow with a coffee that was probably his third of the morning. "Didn't sleep great." "Yeah? How'd Friday go?" Nolan had prepared for this question. He'd practiced the answer in his bathroom mirror while brushing his teeth, trying to find the right balance of disappointed but not devastated. "It didn't work out." Marcus's face fell. "Seriously? I thought you two would be perfect together." "We weren't compatible." That was true enough. You couldn't get much more incompatible than boss and employee who'd accidentally ended up on a blind date together. "Did you at least give it a real shot? Actually talk to her?" "We talked. It just didn't go anywhere." Marcus looked like he wanted to push further, but Jennifer from accounting chose that moment to stick her head into the hallway and announce that the morning meeting was starting in 5 minutes. Nolan had never been so grateful for Jennifer's obsessive punctuality in his life. The meeting was in the main conference room, which meant Sabrina would be there. Nolan took a seat toward the back, opened his laptop, and told himself he was not going to look at her. He was going to focus on the quarterly projections and the new client proposals, and literally anything else. He made it about 4 minutes. Sabrina stood at the front of the room, walking through a presentation about projected growth and market expansion. She spoke the way she always did, clear, direct, no wasted words. But every time she paused to let people ask questions, Nolan caught himself watching her instead of his screen, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was thinking, the exact angle of her shoulders when someone asked something she considered obvious. Nolan. He looked up to find the entire room staring at him, Sabrina included. "Sorry, what?" Marcus elbowed him under the table. Ms. Cole asked if your team had finished the back-end integration for the Morrison project. "Yowa ashiki o tapo." The Morrison project. Of course. Nolan scrambled to pull up the right files on his laptop, very aware that Sabrina was still looking at him with that same polite, professional expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "We're at 85%, he said. "Should be fully complete by end of week. Any obstacles?" "Not significant ones. We had some issues with the API documentation, but we worked around it." Sabrina nodded once. "Good. Keep me updated if that changes." Then she moved on to the next agenda item, and Nolan went back to pretending he was focused on his screen while his heart did uncomfortable things in his chest that hearts weren't supposed to do during quarterly business meetings. When the meeting finally ended, Nolan grabbed his laptop and headed for the door as quickly as he could without literally running. He made it halfway down the hall before he heard his name. "Mr. Hayes." He turned. Sabrina was standing a few feet away, her expression still completely neutral, professional, like they were nothing more than CEO and employee having a brief hallway conversation about work. Yes, Ms. Cole? I need to see the updated timeline for Morrison. Can you have it on my desk by end of day? Of course. Thank you. She walked past him, and that should have been the end of it. But just before she turned the corner, she glanced back. It was quick, barely a second. But Nolan saw something in her face that wasn't professional at all. Then she was gone. The week dragged on like that. Nolan saw Sabrina in meetings, in the hallway, once in the break room when he was refilling his coffee, and she was checking something on her phone. Every interaction was perfectly appropriate, professional, exactly what it needed to be. And every single one of them made Nolan feel like he was trying to hold his breath underwater. By Friday, he was actually looking forward to his shift at the youth center. At least there he could focus on something that wasn't Sabrina Cole and the increasingly complicated mess his brain was making of a situation that should have been simple to navigate. He showed up at the center at 9 in the morning, carrying the lesson plan he'd put together for Keisha and the other advanced students. The computer lab was already full of kids, most of them high schoolers who'd rather be literally anywhere else but had been told by parents or probation officers that they needed to be here. Mr. Hayes! Keisha spotted him first, waving from her usual spot in the corner. She was already logged into one of the machines, a notebook covered in code snippets open beside her. Morning, Keisha. You're here early. Wanted to finish the algorithm we started last week. I think I figured out the recursion problem. Nolan pulled up a chair. Show me. They were halfway through debugging her code when someone knocked on the lab door. Nolan looked up, expecting maybe the center director or another volunteer. It was Sabrina. She was dressed differently than she was at work. Jeans, a simple sweater, her hair down instead of pulled back. It should have made her look less intimidating, but somehow it didn't. She looked real, like an actual person instead of a corporate figurehead, and that was somehow worse. Ms. Cole, Nolan said, and his voice came out steadier than he'd expected. I didn't know you were coming by today. Board meeting in an hour. I wanted to check on the new equipment first. Her eyes moved from Nolan to Keisha, and her expression softened in a way he'd never seen at work. You must be Keisha. Keisha looked between them, confused. How do you know my name? Mr. Hayes told me about you, about how talented you are. Sabrina pulled a laptop case from her shoulder bag and set it on the table. This is for you. Keisha stared at the case like it might explode. What? A laptop, so you can practice at home. I can't. Keisha's voice cracked. That's too expensive. I can't accept that. Yes, you can. And you will, because you're going to do something important with it. Sabrina's voice was firm but not unkind. Mr. Hayes says you're better than most professional developers he knows. I want to see what you can do when you have the tools you need. Keisha's eyes were shining, and Nolan felt something crack open in his chest. He'd seen Sabrina run meetings, negotiate contracts, tear apart bad proposals with surgical precision. But this was different. This was her actually giving a damn about something that mattered, and it was completely destroying every defense mechanism he'd spent the week building. Thank you, Keisha whispered. Don't thank me. Just make sure Mr. Hayes sends me updates on your progress. I want to know if you build anything interesting. After Keisha went back to her code, now with significantly more enthusiasm, Sabrina turned to Nolan. Can we talk? They walked out into the hallway, far enough from the lab that no one would overhear. Sabrina leaned against the wall, and for the first time since the blind date, she looked uncertain. I can't stop thinking about Friday, she said quietly. Nolan's heart kicked against his ribs. Me neither. That's a problem. Yeah. You work for me. There are rules about this kind of thing, power dynamics, ethical concerns, about 50 HR violations waiting to happen. I know. Sabrina closed her eyes briefly. I've spent 10 years building this company. I've made a lot of sacrifices to get where I am. I can't risk that for... She stopped, shook her head. I shouldn't even be having this conversation. Then why are you? Because I don't know how to stop. The words hung between them, raw and honest in a way that made Nolan forget they were standing in a community center hallway where anyone could walk by. He knew what he should say. He should tell her they'd both forget about it, move on, keep things professional. That was the smart move, the safe move. Instead, he said, There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from here. Sabrina looked at him. What? It's not connected to work. No one from the office goes there. We could talk. Just talk. That's still a bad idea, probably. She studied his face for a long moment, and Nolan could see her working through the decision in real time. Weighing risks, calculating consequences, doing exactly what had made her successful in the first place. 1 hour? She said finally. And we're just talking. The coffee shop was small and crowded, the kind of place that survived on regulars and stubbornness, rather than anything resembling ambiance. They got their drinks, black coffee for both of them, and found a table shoved into the back corner. I don't do this, Sabrina said once they were sitting. I don't date employees. I don't blur lines. I've seen what happens when people in positions of power abuse that, and I won't be that person. I'm not asking you to be. Then what are you asking? Nolan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, trying to figure out how to explain something he barely understood himself. I spent 2 years after Rachel left just trying to survive, get through each day, make sure Ethan was okay, keep my job. I didn't have room for anything else. And then I had dinner with you, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe there was something worth wanting. Nolan, I'm not saying we should date. I'm not saying we should do anything that would put either of us at risk. But I can't pretend Friday night didn't happen. And I don't think you can either. Sabrina was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the side of her cup. When I started the company, I was 22 and completely broke. I maxed out 3 credit cards, lived on ramen and spite, worked 100-hour weeks because if I didn't, the whole thing would collapse. It took everything. My relationships, my health, any chance at a normal life. But I built something real, something that matters. I know. Do you? Because what you're suggesting could destroy that. If people find out we're seeing each other, they won't see 2 adults making a choice. They'll see a CEO sleeping with an employee. They'll assume you got promoted because of me, or that I'm playing favorites. Your reputation gets damaged, mine gets destroyed, and the company suffers. You're right, Nolan said, about all of it. So why are we still sitting here? Because you walked into that community center today and gave a laptop to a 14-year-old girl who needed someone to believe in her. Because when you talk about the youth center, you sound like you actually care. Because I've spent the last week trying to convince myself that you're just my boss and nothing more, and it's not working. Sabrina set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. This is insane. Completely. We barely know each other. That's true. And the power imbalance makes this incredibly complicated. I get it. She looked at him, and Nolan saw the exact moment her resolve cracked. What do you want from me? I don't know, he admitted. But I'd like the chance to figure it out. They sat there in silence, the noise of the coffee shop filling the space between them. People arguing about sports at the counter, someone's phone ringing 3 tables over, the hiss of the espresso machine behind the bar. Normal sounds from a normal day, except nothing about this felt normal at all. If we do this, Sabrina said slowly, it stays completely separate from work. We don't tell anyone. We don't let it affect our professional relationship in any way. Agreed. And if it becomes a problem, if it puts either of us at risk, we end it immediately. Okay. I'm serious, Nolan. I won't let this destroy what I've built. I wouldn't ask you to. Sabrina picked up her coffee again, took a long drink, then met his eyes. I must be out of my mind. Join the club. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. When's your next free evening? Tomorrow. Ethan's with my parents for the weekend. There's a gallery opening in Capitol Hill. Contemporary art, probably terrible wine. I was supposed to go alone. Are you asking me on a date, Ms. Cole? Don't push your luck, Mr. Hayes. They finished their coffee and left separately, Sabrina first, then Nolan 10 minutes later. It felt ridiculous, sneaking around like teenagers, but the caution was necessary. Neither of them could afford to be careless. That night, after Ethan was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Nolan sat on his couch and tried to process what he'd just agreed to, dating his boss, in secret, while trying to maintain a professional relationship at work that wouldn't raise any red flags. It was objectively a terrible idea, His phone buzzed with the text from an unknown number. "It's Sabrina. Just making sure you have my personal number. The gallery opens at 7 tomorrow." Nolan saved her contact and stared at it for longer than was probably healthy. Then he typed back a response. "I'll be there." Another buzz. "This is still a bad idea." "Yeah, it really is. See you tomorrow." Nolan set his phone down and leaned back against the couch. He should be terrified. He should be backing out right now, sending a text that said he'd changed his mind, that they should both forget this ever happened. Instead, he was already thinking about what to wear to a gallery opening. The weekend passed in a blur. Nolan dropped Ethan off at his parents' place, endured 20 minutes of his mother asking when he was going to start dating again, then drove back into the city with his stomach in knots. The gallery was in a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial lighting. Nolan arrived exactly at 7 and found Sabrina already there, standing in front of a painting that looked like someone had thrown paint at a canvas and called it Vision. She was wearing a dress. Dark blue, simple, nothing flashy, but it made Nolan forget how to breathe properly for a second. "You made it," she said when he walked up. "Traffic wasn't too bad." "That's a terrible conversation opener. I'm out of practice." She smiled, and it was the real smile, the one from the restaurant. "Come on, let's pretend we understand what any of this art is supposed to mean." They wandered through the gallery, making up increasingly absurd interpretations for each piece. Sabrina claimed one sculpture represented humanity's struggle with modern technology. Nolan argued it was clearly about breakfast cereal. They debated the point for 10 minutes, both of them knowing it was ridiculous, neither of them willing to back down. It was the most fun Nolan had had in years. Later, they ended up at a quiet bar a few blocks away, sitting in a corner booth that gave them privacy from the rest of the crowd. Sabrina ordered whiskey again, and Nolan was starting to understand that it wasn't just a drink choice. It was a statement about who she was when she wasn't being a CEO. "Tell me about Ethan," she said. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What he's like, what makes him happy, how you're managing to raise him alone and still show up to work every day." So Nolan told her about Ethan's obsession with dinosaurs and space and building elaborate structures out of Legos, about how the kid was too smart for his own good sometimes, asking questions that Nolan had no idea how to answer, about the hard days when Nolan felt like he was failing at both fatherhood and his career, stretched too thin to do either one properly. "Rachel left a note," he said at one point, surprised he was even saying it out loud. "Just a note on the kitchen counter. Said she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't be a mother, couldn't pretend she wanted that life. She was gone before I even woke up." Sabrina's hand moved across the table, covering his. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." He looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. "Ethan asks about her sometimes. I don't know what to tell him. The truth? That his mother decided he wasn't worth staying for? That's not a truth any 7-year-old should have to carry." "No," Sabrina said quietly. "It's not." They sat like that for a while, her hand still on his, the noise of the bar washing over them. Eventually Sabrina pulled back, but not before squeezing his fingers once. "My turn," she said. "Ask me something. Why did you start the company?" "That's what you want to know?" "You said it took everything. I want to understand what would be worth that." Sabrina leaned back in the booth, considering. "When I was in college, I watched my mother work 3 jobs just to keep us afloat after my father left. She was brilliant, could have done anything if she'd had the opportunity, but she didn't. She had bills and responsibilities and a system that didn't care how smart she was. I started the company because I wanted to build something different, something that gave people chances they wouldn't get otherwise." "Is that why you fund the youth center?" "Partly. Also because I know what it's like to be the kid who doesn't fit in anywhere. The center gave me a place when I didn't have one." Nolan studied her face, seeing pieces come together that he'd never understood before. "You volunteered there for 6 years, until the company took off, and I didn't have time anymore. Joining the board was supposed to be a compromise, but it's not the same. You miss it. Every day." The conversation shifted after that, moving through topics with an ease that shouldn't have been possible for 2 people who barely knew each other. They talked about books and music, and the fact that they both hated superhero movies but kept watching them anyway. Sabrina told him about learning to code in her mother's basement. Nolan told her about the first time Ethan had called him Dad instead of Daddy, and how it had felt like losing something and gaining something at the same time. By the time they left the bar, it was past midnight. They stood on the sidewalk, and Nolan knew he should probably say goodnight and go home. Keep things from moving too fast, too far. "I don't want tonight to end," Sabrina said. "Me neither. But it probably should." "Yeah." She stepped closer, and Nolan's heart rate kicked up about 3 notches. "Monday's going to be hard." "We'll manage." "Will we?" Instead of answering, Nolan kissed her. It was brief, careful, the kind of kiss that asked a question instead of making a statement. When he pulled back, Sabrina was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "We're terrible at good decisions," she said. "Absolutely awful." She kissed him again, and this time it wasn't careful at all. Monday came too fast and hit too hard. Nolan sat in his car in the company parking lot for a full 5 minutes before he could make himself walk inside. The weekend had felt like something out of someone else's life. Stolen moments and conversations that went too deep too quickly, and the memory of Sabrina's mouth against his that he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. Now he had to go back to pretending none of it had happened. The office looked exactly the same as it always did. Same gray carpet, same fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill, same smell of burnt coffee from the break room. But everything felt different now, like Nolan was walking through a familiar space wearing the wrong skin. Marcus caught him at his desk before he could even boot up his computer. "Hey man, how was your weekend?" "Quiet. Ethan was with my parents." "So you had the whole place to yourself and you did nothing? That's depressing." "I went to an art gallery." Marcus blinked. "You? Art gallery? Are you feeling okay?" "Just trying new things." "Next you're going to tell me you started jogging or joined a book club." Marcus dropped into the chair beside Nolan's desk. "Listen, about the blind date thing, I'm sorry it didn't work out. Claire's already trying to set up round 2 with someone else if you're interested." Nolan's stomach dropped. "What?" "Yeah, she feels bad that the first one was a bust. Says she knows this woman who works at—" "No." It came out sharper than Nolan intended. "I mean, thanks, but I'm not interested." Marcus studied him with an expression that was a little too knowing for comfort. "You sure? You seem different." "I'm fine, just tired." "If you say so." The morning dragged. Nolan tried to focus on the Morrison project timeline, on the back-end integration that still needed debugging, on literally anything that wasn't the way Sabrina had looked at him Saturday night when she'd said she didn't want it to end. He made it until the afternoon meeting before his carefully constructed focus completely fell apart. Sabrina walked into the conference room wearing the same kind of sharp suit she always wore, her expression set to the same professional mask she used for every business discussion. She didn't look at Nolan any differently than she looked at anyone else. Didn't acknowledge him except to ask a direct question about project deliverables that he answered in the most boring, technical way possible. It should have been reassuring. Proof that they could pull this off, that they could keep work and whatever was happening between them completely separate. Instead, it made Nolan feel hollow. The meeting ended, and people filed out in the usual chaotic scramble of conversations about deadlines and weekend plans. Nolan was halfway to the door when he heard his name. "Mr. Hayes, a moment." He turned. Sabrina was still at the head of the table, gathering papers that probably didn't need gathering. Everyone else had already left. "Yes, Ms. Cole?" She waited until the door clicked shut before looking up. "That was harder than I expected." "Yeah. Sitting 10 feet away from you and pretending I don't know what you look like when you smile. It's—" She stopped, shook her head. "We can't do this here." "I know. Tonight, my place. I'll text you the address." "Sabrina, I need to see you, not at work, not where we have to pretend." Nolan should have said no, should have pointed out that this was exactly the kind of thing they'd agreed to be careful about. Instead, he said, "What time?" 7, and use the side entrance. The parking garage has cameras, but they don't cover that door. It felt absurd. planning a secret meeting like they were spies instead of two adults who just wanted to spend time together. But the absurdity was necessary. They both knew what was at stake. Sabrina's building was the kind of place Nolan couldn't afford, even if he worked 3 jobs. Glass and steel and a doorman who looked at him like he'd wandered in from the wrong zip code. He found the side entrance like she'd instructed, and she was waiting there, holding the door open. "You made it." "Your directions were very detailed." She smiled, but it looked strained. "Come on, I'm on the 15th floor." Her apartment was exactly what Nolan had expected, and nothing like it at the same time. Clean lines, expensive furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city that probably cost more per month than his entire rent. But there were also books stacked on the coffee table, a sweater thrown over the back of the couch, a coffee mug sitting on the kitchen counter that hadn't been washed yet. Signs of an actual person living here, not just a showroom. "Nice place," he said. "It's too big. I bought it thinking I'd grow into it, but I'm never here long enough to use half the space." Sabrina moved to the kitchen, pulled out 2 glasses. "Wine? Or something stronger?" "Whatever you're having." She poured wine, handed him a glass, then leaned against the counter. "Today was awful." "It wasn't great. I kept thinking about Saturday, about how easy it was when we weren't trying to hide. And then in that meeting, watching you pretend you barely knew me." She stopped, took a drink. "I hated it. We agreed to keep it separate. I know we did, but knowing something intellectually and actually living it are 2 completely different things." Nolan set his glass down and crossed the space between them. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. That this gets easier? That we'll figure it out? I think we're both smart enough to know this probably doesn't get easier." Sabrina laughed, but it sounded rough. "Well, that's reassuring." "You want reassuring? Find someone who's not your employee." "Is that what you want? For me to find someone else?" "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended. "But I also don't want to be the reason your career falls apart. That's my choice to make." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, if this blows up, you lose everything and I just lose a job. That's not exactly equal stakes." Sabrina set her glass down with enough force that wine sloshed over the rim. "You think I haven't thought about that? You think I don't wake up every morning and run through every possible way this could destroy everything I've built? I know the risks, Nolan. I've spent the last week doing nothing but calculating them." "Then why are we doing this?" "Because for the first time in 10 years, I met someone who makes me feel like I'm more than just a CEO. Someone who sees me, not what I've accomplished or what I can do for them." Her voice cracked slightly. "And I'm selfish enough to not want to let that go." Nolan pulled her close, and she came without hesitation. They stood like that in her 2-big kitchen, holding on to each other like they were the only stable thing in a world that had tilted sideways. "We'll be careful," he said against her hair. "We'll make this work." "You don't know that." "No, but I'm choosing to believe it anyway." She pulled back enough to look at him, and something in her expression shifted. "Stay tonight." "I can't. Ethan's with Mrs. Chen, and I told her I'd be back by 10. "Right, of course. But I can stay for a few more hours." They ended up on her couch, talking the way they had at the bar, but with less caution now that they were alone. Sabrina told him about the company's early days, about sleeping in her office because she couldn't afford rent and office space at the same time, about the first major contract that had felt like proof she wasn't completely delusional, about the investors who'd dismissed her until she'd forced them to pay attention. Nolan told her about the year after Rachel left, when he'd been so exhausted he'd fallen asleep at his desk twice and had to lie to his boss about having the flu, about the night Ethan had asked why his mom didn't love them anymore, and how Nolan had locked himself in the bathroom after putting his son to bed and cried for the first time since the breakup. "Does it still hurt?" Sabrina asked, thinking about her. "Not the way it used to. It's more like I don't miss her. I miss the idea of what I thought we had, the life I thought we were building. I've never had that. A serious relationship, I mean. There was someone in college, but it didn't last past graduation. After that, I was too focused on the company. No regrets? Some." She shifted closer. but fewer now than I had a month ago. Nolan left at 9:30, slipping out the side entrance the same way he'd come in. The drive home felt longer than it should have, his mind still back in Sabrina's apartment, replaying conversations and the way she'd looked at him when she'd asked him to stay. This was dangerous. He knew it was dangerous, but he couldn't make himself care enough to stop. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that was equal parts thrilling and exhausting. At work, Nolan and Sabrina were nothing more than CEO and employee. Professional, appropriate, careful never to let their interactions last longer than necessary. But outside the office, they stole whatever time they could find. Late dinners at restaurants far from anywhere their coworkers might go. Walks through parks where no one knew their names. Quiet evenings at Sabrina's apartment where they could stop pretending for a few hours. Nolan introduced her to Ethan on a Saturday afternoon at the youth center, framing it as a coincidence that they were both volunteering at the same time. His son took to her immediately, showing off the robot he'd built in the beginner engineering class and explaining in exhaustive detail how the motors worked. "He's brilliant," Sabrina said later, after Ethan had run off to join the other kids for lunch. "He has your eyes." And Rachel's stubbornness, unfortunately. "I don't know. I think the stubbornness might be all you." They were careful. So careful. Nolan started parking his car a block away from Sabrina's building and walking the rest of the way. They never texted about anything that couldn't be explained as work-related. When they saw each other in the office, they made sure other people were always around. It worked for almost a month. Then Jennifer from accounting mentioned to Marcus that she'd seen someone who looked a lot like Nolan getting into a car outside a building downtown. Marcus mentioned it to Nolan as a joke, asking if he had a secret girlfriend he wasn't telling anyone about. Nolan laughed it off, said Jennifer must have seen someone else, but the comment sat in his gut like a stone. He told Sabrina that night, and he watched her face go carefully blank. "We need to be more careful. We're already being careful. Not careful enough. If people are starting to notice, it was one comment from someone who wasn't even sure it was me. This time. What about next time?" Nolan set down the beer he'd been drinking. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we need to pull back, see each other less often, at least until things settle down." "You want to stop?" "I want to not destroy both our lives." Sabrina's voice was rising, stress bleeding through the control she usually maintained. "I've worked too hard for this, Nolan. I can't lose it because we got careless." "So what? We just pretend this never happened? Go back to being strangers?" "I don't know. I don't have all the answers." They stood on opposite sides of her living room, the space between them feeling wider than it had any right to be. Nolan could see the fear in her face, the same calculation she'd been running since the beginning now coming due. "I'm not asking you to risk everything," he said quietly, "but I'm also not going to pretend I don't care about you, because it's complicated. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. Then what do you want? Just tell me what you want." Sabrina closed her eyes. "I want to not have to choose between you and everything else I've built. But that's not realistic, is it? Maybe it doesn't have to be a choice. You're being naive. And you're being a coward." The words hung between them, sharp and unforgiving. Sabrina's eyes snapped open, and for a second Nolan thought she was going to tell him to leave. Instead, she just looked tired. "You should go," she said. "Sabrina, please, I need to think, and I can't do that with you here." Nolan left without arguing, because pushing would only make things worse. But the drive home felt like something breaking, and he couldn't tell if it was fixable or if they'd just hit the wall he'd known was coming from the start. He didn't hear from her for 3 days. No texts, no calls, nothing. At work, Sabrina was noticeably absent from the meetings Nolan usually attended. Claire mentioned she was dealing with investor calls and strategic planning, but Nolan knew avoidance when he saw it. On the 4th day, his phone buzzed during lunch. "We need to talk. Tonight, my office. After everyone leaves." Nolan stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Okay." The office was empty by 7. Nolan waited an extra 10 minutes before heading to the executive wing, just to make sure no one would see him. Sabrina's door was closed but unlocked. He knocked once and walked in. She was sitting at her desk, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Close the door." He did. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not having to choose." She stood up, moved to the window. You were right. I was being a coward. I was so focused on protecting what I've built that I forgot why I built it in the first place. Sabrina, let me finish, please. She turned to face him. I don't know how to make this work. I don't know how to balance a relationship with you and run this company without everything falling apart. But I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of living like the only thing that matters is the next quarter's earnings. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to try, really try. Not just stolen moments and hiding. I want to figure out how to actually be with you. Nolan crossed the room, stopped a foot away from her. People are going to find out eventually. I know. It's going to be messy. I know that too. And you're sure? Instead of answering, Sabrina kissed him. It was different from the careful kisses they'd shared before, more desperate, like she was trying to prove something to both of them. I'm sure, she said when they broke apart. Terrified but sure. They stood in her office, holding each other while the city lights flickered beyond the window. Nolan knew they were standing on the edge of something that could destroy them both. But for the first time since this whole thing started, he felt like maybe they had a chance. That feeling lasted exactly 12 more hours. Nolan walked into work the next morning to find Marcus waiting at his desk with an expression Nolan had never seen before. We need to talk. About what? The Morrison project. There's a problem with the budget. Nolan's stomach dropped. What kind of problem? The kind where we're showing expenses that don't match any of the approved spending. The kind where someone's going to get audited, and right now, you're the one whose name is on all the reports. The office suddenly felt very small and very cold. I didn't approve anything that wasn't documented. Then where did $50,000 go? I don't know. I'd have to look at the actual... Finance is already looking, and they're not happy. Marcus lowered his voice. Nolan, this looks really bad. Like career-ending bad. Nolan pulled up the Morrison files on his computer, his hands moving faster than his brain could process what he was seeing. Expenses he didn't recognize. Approvals with his signature that he didn't remember making. Numbers that didn't add up, no matter how many times he ran them. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. I didn't approve half of this. Can you prove that? I don't know, maybe. I need time to go through everything. But time was apparently something he didn't have. An hour later, he was called into a meeting with finance and HR. They asked questions he couldn't answer about spending he didn't authorize. They showed him reports with his name on them that he'd never seen before. And through it all, Nolan felt the ground disappearing beneath his feet. Sabrina wasn't in the meeting. Of course she wasn't. She was the CEO, and this was an internal investigation that hadn't escalated to her level yet. But Nolan knew it would. Eventually, this would land on her desk, and she'd have to make a decision about what to do with an employee who appeared to have either committed fraud or been catastrophically incompetent. The meeting ended with a suspension, pending investigation, effective immediately. Nolan was escorted back to his desk to collect his personal items, and he could feel everyone watching. Jennifer, from accounting. The new guy whose name he could never remember. Marcus, who looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He made it to his car before the full weight of it hit him. His job was gone. Maybe not officially, not yet, but the writing was clear enough. Even if they couldn't prove he'd done anything wrong, the suspicion alone would be enough to destroy his reputation. No one would hire someone who'd been investigated for financial misconduct, proven innocent or not. And Ethan, how was he supposed to explain this to Ethan? His phone buzzed, a text from Sabrina. I just heard, meet me at my place, now. Nolan drove to her building on autopilot, his mind too fractured to process anything beyond the basic mechanics of steering and braking. Sabrina met him at the side entrance again, but this time she didn't wait until they were upstairs. She pulled him into a service hallway and wrapped her arms around him before he could say a word. I'm going to fix this, she said. You can't. If you get involved, people will know I don't care. Sabrina, you'll lose everything. She pulled back, looked him straight in the eye. Then I'll lose it. But I'm not letting you take the fall for something you didn't do. You don't know that I didn't. Yes, I do. I know you, Nolan. You're not capable of this. The reports have my signature. Then someone forged them, or there's a system error, Or something else is going on that we haven't figured out yet. But I'm not standing by while they destroy you. Nolan wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her that this was exactly the kind of thing they'd been afraid of. That getting involved would only prove people's worst suspicions about their relationship. But he was too tired and too scared to fight. "What are you going to do, Kees?" he asked. "I'm going to find out what actually happened, and then I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." She meant it. Nolan could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her hands had balled into fists at her sides. Sabrina Cole had built an empire on determination and refusing to accept defeat, and now she was aiming all of that focused intensity at saving him. It should have felt reassuring. Instead, it just made him more afraid. "You can't do this alone," he said. "Watch me." "Sabrina, if you start digging into this and people find out we're involved, they'll say you're covering for me. That'll make everything worse." She stepped back, ran a hand through her hair in a gesture of frustration he'd come to recognize. "So what's your suggestion? I just let them destroy you?" "I'm saying be smart about it. Don't make yourself a target too. It's too late for that. The moment I decided I cared about you, I became a target." She moved to the window, stared out at the city like it might have answers she couldn't find. "I've been thinking about this wrong from the beginning, trying to keep everything separate, like work and my personal life existed in different universes. But they don't. They can't." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time to stop hiding." Nolan felt his heart kick against his ribs. "You want to tell people about us? Now? In the middle of an investigation that makes me look like a criminal?" "Not ideal timing, I know." "Not ideal?" "Sabrina, it's the worst possible timing." She turned to face him. "Or it's the only timing that matters. Right now, if I investigate this, people will assume I'm just doing my job as CEO. But if I investigate it while everyone knows we're together, they'll assume I'm protecting you, which means I need to find proof so solid that no one can claim I'm being biased. That's a huge risk. Everything about this has been a risk." Nolan wanted to argue, but she wasn't wrong. They'd been taking risks since the moment they decided not to walk away from each other in that restaurant. The only difference now was that the stakes had gotten impossibly higher. "Okay," he said finally, "but we do this the right way. We document everything. We make sure there's a clear paper trail that shows your investigation was legitimate. Already planning to. I've got access to the financial systems. I can pull the raw data, compare it to what was in the reports they showed you." "When?" "Tonight. After hours, when no one's watching what I'm accessing. I should be there. You're suspended. You can't be in the building. Then I'll wait at your place. You can bring the files there." Sabrina hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but this stays between us until we know what we're dealing with." He left through the side entrance again, driving back to his apartment with his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. Someone had either made a massive mistake or deliberately framed him, and he couldn't figure out which option was worse. A mistake could be fixed, but it still meant his reputation would be damaged. A frame job meant someone wanted him gone badly enough to commit fraud. Mrs. Chen was waiting at his apartment with Ethan, who launched himself at Nolan the moment he walked through the door. "Dad, Mrs. Chen let me have ice cream for snack. Did she now?" Nolan shot his neighbor a look. "Mrs." Chen shrugged, unapologetic. "He said you had a bad day. Ice cream seemed appropriate." "How did you—" Nolan started, then realized Ethan was looking at him with those two observant eyes that missed nothing. "Marcus called," Ethan said. "He sounded worried. Said something about work being complicated." Of course Marcus had called, probably trying to reach Nolan and getting the home number instead when his cell went to voicemail. Nolan made a mental note to thank him later and simultaneously kill him for worrying a 7-year-old. "Work is complicated," Nolan agreed, "but it's nothing for you to worry about." "Are you going to lose your job?" The question hit harder than it should have. Nolan knelt down so he was eye level with his son. "I don't know, buddy. Maybe. But even if I do, we'll be okay. Promise?" "Promise." Ethan seemed satisfied with that, running off to his room to play while Nolan paid Mrs. Chen and tried not to think about how many promises he'd made in his life that he couldn't actually guarantee. After she left, he attempted to make dinner, but his heart wasn't in it. They ended up ordering pizza, and Ethan seemed thrilled enough with that decision that Nolan didn't feel too guilty about taking the easy route. His phone buzzed around 9 after Ethan was in bed. "Found something. You need to see this." Nolan called her instead of texting back. "What did you find?" "Not over the phone. Can you come over?" "Ethan's asleep. I can't leave him." There was a pause. "I could come to you." That was a terrible idea for about 15 different reasons, most of them involving the fact that Sabrina Cole had never been to his apartment and the place was a mess, and this was mixing their worlds in a way they'd carefully avoided. But the urgency in her voice overrode his hesitation. "Okay, but park a block away just in case." She arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a laptop bag and looking more disheveled than he'd ever seen her. Her hair was coming loose from whatever she'd used to pin it back, and there were shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Come in," Nolan said, hyper-aware of the pizza box still on the counter and the pile of Ethan's toys in the corner and every other sign that this was the home of someone barely keeping it together. If Sabrina noticed the mess, she didn't comment. She just set her laptop on the kitchen table and opened it up. "Look at this." The screen showed a series of financial records, expense reports, approval chains. Nolan leaned closer, trying to make sense of the data. "These are the Morrison Project files," Sabrina said, pointing. "Official ones, pulled directly from the company system. See these expense entries?" "Yeah. They're dated 2 months ago. But here's the thing." She pulled up another window. "This is the system audit log. Every time someone accesses or modifies a financial record, it gets logged. Date, time, user ID." Nolan scanned the log, his pulse starting to pick up. "These entries were created last week." "Exactly. Someone went in retroactively and added expenses to the Morrison budget, backdated them to look like they'd been there all along." "Can you tell who?" "That's where it gets interesting. The user ID shows as yours." Nolan's stomach dropped. "I didn't do this." "I know you didn't. Because your user account was logged into the system from 2 different IP addresses at the same time. One from your desk at the office, the other from an external network that traces back to a coffee shop in Belltown. How is that possible?" "It's not. Not unless someone cloned your credentials." Sabrina's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up more data. "There's more. The software we use for financial tracking had an update pushed 3 months ago. Nothing major. Just a routine patch, except the patch had a bug in it that wasn't caught during testing." "What kind of bug?" "The kind that lets someone with the right access modify historical records without the system flagging it as suspicious. The update was supposed to fix a reporting issue, but it accidentally created a vulnerability." Nolan felt something loosen in his chest, the first real breath he'd taken since the meeting with HR. "So this wasn't me. It was a software problem." "Partly. The bug created the opportunity. But someone still had to exploit it. Someone with access to your credentials and knowledge of the vulnerability. Who would even know about something like that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. The update came from our IT department, but it was developed by an outside contractor. I've got calls into both, but no one's responding at this hour." Nolan sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his mind trying to process everything she'd just laid out. "This proves I didn't do it. It proves the entries were backdated and that your account was compromised. That should be enough to clear you." "Should be. I'll present this to the board tomorrow. Force them to halt the investigation until we figure out exactly what happened and who was responsible." "And when they ask how you found all this?" Sabrina closed the laptop. "I'll tell them the truth, that I ran my own audit because something about the original investigation didn't add up. They're going to ask why you cared enough to investigate personally. Let them ask. Sabrina, I'm done hiding, Nolan. I meant what I said earlier. This stops now." Before he could respond, there was a sound from the hallway. They both turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and holding his dinosaur. "Dad?" "I heard voices." Nolan stood up quickly. "Hey, buddy. Sorry. Did we wake you?" Ethan's gaze moved from Nolan to Sabrina and back again. "Is that Miss Cole? From the youth center?" "Yeah, she just stopped by to talk about work stuff." "At nighttime?" It was a fair question, delivered with the kind of logic that 7-year-olds specialized in. Nolan scrambled for an answer that wouldn't sound like a lie, but also wouldn't require explanations he wasn't ready to give. Sabrina saved him. I know it's late, but your dad's helping me with something important, and I needed his advice. Ethan seemed to accept this, his attention already drifting. Can I have water? Sure, go back to bed. I'll bring it to you. After Ethan shuffled back to his room, Nolan filled a cup and followed. He sat on the edge of his son's bed while Ethan drank, then tucked him back in. Is Ms. Cole your girlfriend? Ethan asked suddenly. Nolan nearly choked. What? Marcus said you needed a girlfriend. And Ms. Cole is nice. She gave Keisha that laptop. It's complicated, buddy. That's what grown-ups always say when the answer is yes, but they don't want to admit it. When did you get so smart? I've always been smart. You just don't notice because you're busy. The observation stung more than it should have. Nolan smoothed back Ethan's hair, feeling the weight of every choice he'd made over the past few months. You're right, I have been busy. I'm sorry. It's okay. As long as you're not too busy to be my dad. Never, I promise. Ethan's eyes were already closing. I like Miss Cole. She's nice to you. Nolan sat there until Ethan's breathing evened out into sleep, then made his way back to the kitchen. Sabrina was standing by the window, looking out at the street below. He's perceptive, she said without turning around. Too perceptive. He's right, though, about me being nice to you. Nolan crossed to stand beside her. You heard that? Sound carries in apartments like this. She glanced at him. He seems like a good kid. He is. Better than I deserve, most days. I doubt that. They stood in silence for a moment, and Nolan thought about Ethan's question. Is Ms. Cole your girlfriend? He didn't even know how to answer that. They were more than colleagues, definitely more than friends. But girlfriend felt too simple for something that had already gotten so complicated. What happens after tomorrow? He asked. I present the evidence to the board. They reopen the investigation, this time looking at the actual cause instead of just blaming you. Hopefully, they clear your name. And us? Sabrina turned to face him fully. I'm going to tell them we're seeing each other. Not during the board meeting, that would be a disaster. But after, in a private conversation with HR. We'll disclose the relationship, set up proper protocols to avoid conflicts of interest. They might fire me anyway, to avoid the appearance of impropriety. They might. Or they might reassign you to a different department where I'm not your direct supervisor. Either way, it'll be out in the open. You've really thought this through. I've thought about nothing else for the past 6 hours. She reached for his hand. I'm scared, Nolan. Terrified, actually. But I'm more scared of losing you than I am of what people might think. What if this destroys everything you've built? Then I'll build something else. I did it once. I can do it again. Nolan pulled her close, and she came willingly, resting her forehead against his chest. You're either very brave or very stupid. Can't it be both? He laughed, despite everything, and felt her smile against his shirt. They stayed like that until Sabrina finally pulled away, checking her watch. I should go. Early morning tomorrow. Be careful. Always am. But when she reached the door, she paused. Nolan, whatever happens tomorrow, I don't regret this. Any of it. Me neither. After she left, Nolan cleaned up the kitchen and tried to prepare himself for whatever tomorrow would bring. He knew Sabrina's plan made sense, that presenting the evidence to the board was the right move. But he also knew that nothing ever went according to plan, especially when emotions and reputations were on the line. Sleep didn't come easy. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in his head. Best case, they cleared his name, accepted his relationship with Sabrina, and everything somehow worked out. Worst case, they fired him, destroyed his reputation, and Sabrina's career took a hit she might never recover from. Somewhere in between was the most likely outcome, messy and complicated and requiring compromises neither of them wanted to make. His phone buzzed around 2 a.m. Can't sleep either? He smiled despite his exhaustion. Nope. I keep going over the presentation, making sure I didn't miss anything. You didn't. You're thorough to a fault. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. There was a pause, then, I wish you were here. Me too. After tomorrow, assuming I'm not fired, do you want to have dinner? Like normal people who don't have to sneak around? I'd like that. Okay, it's a date then. Another pause. A real one this time. Nolan fell asleep with his phone still in his hand, and when he woke up 4 hours later, there was a new message waiting. Good luck today. I'll call you after the meeting. The morning dragged. Nolan tried to keep busy, helping Ethan with breakfast and then dropping him off at school. He considered going to the youth center, but he couldn't focus enough to teach anyone anything useful. Instead, he drove around aimlessly, waiting for his phone to ring. It finally did at 11:30. It's done, Sabrina said, and her voice sounded raw. What happened? The board reviewed the evidence. They're reopening the investigation and putting you on paid leave instead of suspension. They also want to interview the IT contractor who developed the update. That's good news? There's more. I told them about us. Nolan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. And? They weren't happy. There were a lot of questions about ethics and conflicts of interest and whether my investigation was compromised by personal bias. But the evidence speaks for itself. Even if they think I was motivated by wanting to protect you, the data doesn't lie. What does this mean for us? HR wants to meet with both of us next week. They'll probably require some kind of formal arrangement, different reporting structures, disclosure policies, maybe mandatory ethics training. But we can keep seeing each other. As long as we follow whatever guidelines they set up, yes. She let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for hours. They could have fired me, Nolan, or demanded I end the relationship. They didn't. What about your reputation? Damaged but not destroyed. I'll need to rebuild some trust with the board, prove that my judgment isn't compromised. But I knew that going in. Nolan pulled into a parking lot, needing to stop moving while they talked. I'm sorry for all of this. Don't be. I made my choice. Still, you shouldn't have to fight this hard just to be with someone. Maybe not, but you're worth fighting for. Her voice softened. Where are you right now? Random parking lot in Fremont, driving in circles because I couldn't sit still. Come to my office. The investigation's official now, which means there's no reason you can't be here. Are you sure? I'm the CEO. I can invite whoever I want to my office. 20 minutes later, Nolan walked through the lobby of his workplace, feeling like he was entering foreign territory. People stared, some curious, some sympathetic, a few actively hostile. He ignored them all and headed straight for the executive wing. Claire was at her desk, and she gave him a tight smile. She's expecting you. Go on in. Sabrina was standing by her window when he entered, still in the same position he'd found her in so many times. But when she turned, there was something different in her expression, less guarded, like she'd stopped carrying a weight she'd been holding too long. Hey, she said. Hey yourself. She crossed the room and kissed him, right there in her office where anyone walking by could see through the glass walls. It wasn't long, wasn't inappropriate for a workplace, but it was public, deliberate. When she pulled back, she was smiling. That felt good. Dangerous, but good. I'm done with hiding. We both are. Nolan glanced toward the glass walls, saw Claire very deliberately not looking their direction. People are going to talk. Let them. I spent 10 years building this company by not caring what people thought. I'm not going to start now. What about the investigation into who actually manipulated the records? It's on it. They found the vulnerability in the software, and they're tracking who had access to exploit it. Should have answers within a few days. And then what? Then we figure out what normal looks like. She moved back to her desk, gestured for him to sit. I was thinking about what you said about building something that matters. The youth center needs more funding, more programs. What if we expanded it, created opportunities for kids who wouldn't otherwise have them? That's ambitious. I'm good at ambitious. Yeah, you are. They talked for another hour about the center, about what came next, about how to navigate a relationship that was no longer secret but still complicated by power dynamics and workplace politics. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this was easy. But for the first time since that blind date had gone so spectacularly wrong, Nolan felt like maybe they had a real chance. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Heard the news. Glad they're sorting out the Morrison mess. Also heard some other interesting news. Call me. Nolan showed the message to Sabrina, who laughed. That didn't take long. Office gossip moves faster than light. Are you ready for this? For everyone knowing? No, but I'm doing it anyway. She reached across the desk, laced her fingers through his. We'll figure it out, together. Together, Nolan agreed. And despite everything that could still go wrong, he chose to believe her. The office gossip started before Nolan even left the building that day. He could feel it in the way conversation stopped when he walked past, in the sideways glances from people who'd never paid attention to him before. By the time he picked up Ethan from school, his phone had buzzed with texts from at least 6 coworkers, most of them asking variations of the same question Marcus had already posed. He ignored them all except Marcus, who deserved an actual response instead of radio silence. It's true, Nolan typed. Sabrina and I are seeing each other. Started a while ago. Didn't tell anyone because we knew how it would look. The response came back almost immediately. Are you insane? Probably. Does this have anything to do with the Morrison investigation? It's why she found the truth, but the evidence stands on its own. There was a longer pause this time before Marcus replied. You know people are going to assume the worst. Let them. Nolan pocketed his phone and focused on Ethan, who was chattering about something that had happened during recess involving a soccer ball and an argument over rules that apparently still hadn't been resolved. Normal kid problems, the kind that didn't involve career-threatening investigations or relationships that violated every unwritten rule about workplace dynamics. Dad, you're not listening, Ethan said. Sorry, buddy. What did you say? I asked if Ms. Cole is coming to dinner again. I don't know. Maybe. I like her. She doesn't talk to me like I'm stupid. Who talks to you like you're stupid? Ethan shrugged. Some of the teachers, they use baby voices. Ms. Cole talks to me like I'm a real person. Nolan felt something warm settle in his chest, the kind of feeling that came from watching someone he cared about connect with the person who mattered most in his life. She's pretty great, isn't she? Yeah, you should marry her. What? That's what people do when they like each other, right? They get married. It's a little more complicated than that. That's what grown-ups always say? Nolan couldn't argue with that logic, so he didn't try. They stopped for groceries on the way home, and Ethan insisted on picking out ingredients for tacos because apparently Ms. Cole had mentioned once at the youth center that she liked Mexican food. The fact that his 7-year-old was already planning meals around Sabrina should have felt overwhelming, but instead it just felt right. His phone rang while they were unloading groceries. Sabrina's name lit up the screen. Hey, he answered, wedging the phone between his shoulder and ear while he wrestled with a bag that was threatening to spill. It found something. Can you talk? Hang on. He handed Ethan the lighter bags and moved to the living room. Okay, go ahead. They tracked the access logs back to the source. The person who exploited the vulnerability was David Chen from the IT department. He'd been with the company for 3 years, had full system access, and apparently held a grudge about being passed over for a promotion. Why would he target me? You were convenient. Your department was handling Morrison. You had the right level of access. And framing you created enough chaos that he thought no one would look deeper. He was planning to use the confusion to cover up some other irregularities he'd been hiding. Nolan sank onto the couch. So this was never really about me. No, you were just collateral damage. He's been fired, and the company's filing criminal charges. The board's meeting tomorrow to formally clear your name and discuss next steps. Next steps for what? For you. Your position, where you fit in the company now that everyone knows we're together. She paused. They're offering you a choice. You can come back to your current role with some structural changes to reporting lines, or you can move to a different department entirely. Either way, you won't report directly to me anymore. What do you think I should do? That's not my decision to make. I'm asking your opinion. Sabrina was quiet for a moment. I think you should do whatever feels right for you and Ethan. Not what's easiest for the company, not what makes people talk less. What you actually want. What if what I want is complicated? Then it's complicated. We're already living complicated. Might as well lean into it. After they hung up, Nolan sat on the couch and stared at the ceiling, trying to untangle what he actually wanted from what he thought he was supposed to want. The smart move would be to transfer to a different department, put distance between himself and Sabrina at work, make it easier for people to accept their relationship as legitimate rather than scandalous. But the smart move also meant starting over in a new role, learning new systems, working with people who didn't know him. And he was tired of choosing the smart move when what he really wanted was something that felt real. Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Are we making tacos?" "Yeah, buddy, let's make tacos." They cooked together, Ethan manning the cheese grater while Nolan handled everything involving sharp knives and hot surfaces. It was domestic and ordinary and exactly what Nolan needed after a day of extraordinary chaos. "Dad?" Ethan said while they were setting the table. "Yeah?" "If you marry Ms. Cole, does that mean she'll live here?" "We're not getting married." "But if you did?" Nolan set down the plates he'd been carrying. "Why are you so interested in this?" "Because I don't want you to be alone. You're always alone when I'm at school or with Grandma and Grandpa." The observation hit harder than it should have. Nolan knelt down so he was eye level with his son. "I'm not alone. I have you." "That's different. You need grown-up people too. When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just don't notice." Nolan pulled Ethan into a hug, holding on maybe a little longer than necessary. "I love you. You know that?" "I know. I love you too. Can we eat now?" "Well." They ate tacos and watched a nature documentary about whales that Ethan had been excited about all week. Somewhere around the part where the narrator explained migration patterns, Nolan's phone buzzed with another text from Sabrina. "Ethan asked if you're coming to dinner again." There was a pause, then, "He did?" "Apparently you're invited for tacos. Also, he thinks we should get married. He's 7. He's observant." "What did you tell him?" "That it's complicated. He said that's what grown-ups always say." "Smart kid. Too smart for his own good sometimes." Another pause, longer this time. "I'd like to come to dinner, not tonight, but soon, if that's okay." More than okay. The next few days moved faster than Nolan could process. The board formally cleared his name and issued a company-wide memo explaining that the Morrison investigation had uncovered system vulnerabilities that were being addressed. David Chen's name wasn't mentioned, but people talked anyway. Apparently he'd been escorted out by security, and rumors were already spreading about what exactly he'd done. Nolan met with HR on Thursday, sitting across from the same woman who'd suspended him a week earlier. She looked uncomfortable, which was fair considering she was probably realizing how close the company had come to destroying an innocent employee's career. "We owe you an apology, Mr. Hayes. The initial investigation should have been more thorough." "Yeah, it should have. We're prepared to offer you full back pay for the suspension period, plus compensation for the distress this caused." "What about my reputation? You can't exactly compensate for that." She had the decency to look embarrassed. "No, we can't. But we are taking steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. New protocols for financial investigations, better oversight of system access, mandatory training for the investigative team." "Great. That helps the next person." "What about me? What would you like, Mr. Hayes?" It was a fair question, and Nolan had spent the better part of 3 days figuring out the answer. "I want to stay in my current department, doing the work I've been doing. But I also wanted on record that my relationship with Ms. Cole had nothing to do with the investigation or its outcome. I want that clear enough that no one can claim otherwise." "We can do that. And I want to guarantee that if I choose to continue seeing her, it won't affect my position here. No surprise transfers, no sudden performance issues that conveniently appear after we go public." The HR director nodded slowly. "As long as proper protocols are in place to prevent conflicts of interest, your relationship with Ms. Cole is your personal business." "Then we have an agreement." They shook hands, and Nolan left feeling like he'd won something, even if he wasn't entirely sure what. The walk back to his desk felt different this time. People still stared, but there was less hostility now, more curiosity. A few people even nodded or offered tentative smiles. Marcus was waiting at Nolan's desk with coffee and an expression that was hard to read. "So, you and the CEO." "Me and the CEO." "How long?" "Couple months." "And you didn't tell me?" "Would you have told me if you were secretly dating your boss?" Marcus considered this. Fair point. Is it serious? I don't know yet, but I'd like the chance to find out. She seems good for you. I haven't seen you this alive in years. Yeah, well, she's terrifying and brilliant and completely out of my league. So basically perfect. Nolan laughed despite himself. Something like that. That weekend, Sabrina came to dinner. Nolan cooked, or attempted to cook, something more ambitious than tacos, while Ethan helped by taste testing everything and providing running commentary on whether each ingredient was acceptable. Sabrina showed up exactly on time, carrying a bottle of wine and looking nervous in a way Nolan had never seen from her. Hey, she said when he opened the door. Hey yourself, come in. Ethan appeared immediately, launching into an explanation of the menu that Nolan had carefully planned and all the ways it might go wrong because Dad sometimes burned things when he got distracted. Sabrina listened with the same focused attention she gave to board presentations, asking questions and nodding seriously like this was the most important briefing she'd receive all week. Dinner was chaotic in the best way. Ethan dominated the conversation, telling stories about school and the youth center and his current obsession with black holes. Sabrina engaged with all of it, never talking down to him, treating his questions like they deserved real answers. Ms. Cole, do you like my dad? Ethan asked suddenly, with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. Ethan, Nolan started, but Sabrina cut him off. I do. Very much. Are you going to marry him? We haven't talked about that yet. Why do you ask? Because I think you should. He's lonely, and you make him smile. Sabrina glanced at Nolan, and something passed between them that felt too big for a dinner table conversation with a 7-year-old. Your dad is pretty great, isn't he? The best, Ethan agreed. After dinner, they did dishes together while Ethan played in the living room. Sabrina washed, Nolan dried, and it was so painfully domestic that he almost couldn't stand it. He's amazing, Sabrina said quietly. He's opinionated. Wonder where he gets that from. Definitely his mother. She elbowed him, and he caught her hand, pulled her close enough to kiss her temple. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for inviting me. Ethan likes you. I like him too. She set down the plate she'd been washing. Is this weird for you? Me being here in your space with your son? It should be, but it's not. Nolan turned her to face him. It feels right, which is probably the most terrifying thing I could say right now. Why terrifying? Because if this doesn't work out, it's not just me who gets hurt. It's Ethan too. Sabrina's expression softened. Then we don't let it not work out. It's not that simple. Why not? Because relationships end, Sabrina. People leave. I learned that the hard way. I'm not Rachel. I know you're not, but that doesn't mean I'm not scared. She wrapped her arms around him, and they stood like that in his tiny kitchen with dish soap still on their hands and Ethan's laughter drifting in from the other room. I'm scared too, she admitted. I'm scared I'll mess this up, or that the company will force us to choose, or that I'll let you down when you need me most. But I'm more scared of not trying. We're a mess, you know that? The best kind of mess. They finished the dishes and joined Ethan in the living room for a movie that none of them really watched. Sabrina sat between Nolan and Ethan on the couch, and somewhere during the second act, Ethan fell asleep with his head on her shoulder. She looked down at him with an expression Nolan couldn't quite name, something tender and uncertain and hopeful all at once. This okay? She whispered. More than okay. After they put Ethan to bed, Sabrina stayed for another hour. They talked about the company, about the youth center expansion they'd been planning, about nothing and everything. When she finally left, Nolan stood at the door and watched her drive away, feeling the kind of contentment he'd thought was gone from his life forever. The weeks that followed settled into something resembling normal, though normal looked different now than it had before. At work, Nolan and Sabrina maintained professional boundaries, different reporting structures, no favoritism, everything documented and above board. But outside the office, they built something that felt real. Dinner dates that didn't require secrecy. Weekend mornings at the youth center where they worked side by side. Evenings at Sabrina's place or his, learning how to fit their lives together in ways that weren't always smooth, but felt worth the effort. The company gossip eventually died down, replaced by newer scandals and drama. Some people still looked at them sideways, still whispered about power dynamics and whether the relationship was appropriate. But most people moved on because most people had their own lives to worry about. 3 months after the investigation ended, Sabrina presented a proposal to the board for a major expansion of the youth center. New programs, better equipment, scholarships for kids who showed exceptional promise. The funding would come partially from corporate donations and partially from Sabrina's personal wealth, which she'd been accumulating for years without knowing what to do with it. "This is what matters, E.T., she told Nolan after the board approved the proposal. "Not the quarterly earnings or the stock price. This. You're going soft on me, Ms. Cole. Don't let it get around. I have a reputation to maintain." They were standing in the newly renovated computer lab, watching Keisha help younger students debug their code. The girl had flourished over the past few months, her skills growing exponentially now that she had consistent access to equipment and mentorship. She'd already built 2 mobile apps and was working on a third that would help students track homework assignments. "She's going to do something incredible someday," Sabrina said. "She already is." "You know what I mean." Nolan did know. He knew exactly what Sabrina meant because he'd seen the same potential she saw, not just in Keisha, but in all the kids who came through the center looking for something to believe in. And he knew that this, helping kids find their path, was what Sabrina had been missing from her life. All the success, all the money, all the corporate achievements meant nothing compared to seeing a 14-year-old girl realize she could build something that mattered. "Thank you," Nolan said. "For what?" "For being you. For caring about this. For not giving up when everything got hard." Sabrina laced her fingers through his. "You made it worth not giving up." 6 months after that disastrous blind date, Nolan stood in front of his bathroom mirror and tried to remember how to tie a decent knot in a tie. He'd gotten out of practice, relying too much on casual work attire, and not enough on occasions that required looking put together. Tonight required put together. He'd made a reservation at the same restaurant where they'd first met, though this time there was no element of surprise. Sabrina knew exactly where they were going and why. He'd been not so subtly hinting at wanting to talk about something important for the past 2 weeks. Ethan appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his pajamas, even though it was barely 7. "You look nervous." "I'm not nervous." "You're lying. Your eye does that twitching thing when you lie." "Since when do you notice my eye twitching?" "Since always." "Are you going to ask Ms. Cole to marry you?" Nolan froze mid-knot. "What makes you think that?" "You've been acting weird, and you asked Grandma for Mom's ring last week. I heard you on the phone." There was no point in denying it. Ethan was too observant for his own good, and Nolan had never been particularly skilled at keeping secrets from his own kid. "Yeah, I'm going to ask her." "Good. She'll say yes." "How do you know?" "Because she looks at you the way you look at chocolate cake, like you're the best thing ever." Nolan laughed and pulled Ethan into a hug. "When did you get so smart about relationships?" "I watch a lot of TV while you're working." "That's not reassuring." Mrs. Chen arrived to watch Ethan, and Nolan drove to the restaurant with his heart doing uncomfortable things in his chest. The ring was in his pocket, a simple band that had belonged to his mother before Rachel had worn it briefly and then left it behind when she disappeared. He'd had it cleaned and resized, and now it felt like it was burning a hole through his jacket. Sabrina was already there, sitting at a table by the window. The same table where they'd sat that first night, both of them horrified and trying to figure out how to escape without making things worse. "Hey," she said when he sat down. "Hey yourself." "You look nervous." "Your eyes twitching." She smiled, and it was the real smile. The one she saved for moments when her guard was down and she didn't have to be a CEO, or a board member, or anything other than herself. "What's going on, Nolan?" He could have done this the smooth way. Could have waited until after dinner, made some romantic speech, followed whatever script people used for these situations. But smooth had never been his style, and Sabrina deserved better than a performance. "I've been thinking about that first night," he said. "How we both wanted to run as soon as we saw each other. How we stayed anyway because leaving would have been admitting defeat." I remember. "You told me about the youth center, about why you funded it, and I realized you weren't just some terrifying CEO. You were someone who actually gave a damn about things that mattered." Where are you going with this? Nolan reached across the table, took her hand. I spent 2 years after Rachel left just trying to survive, trying to be a good father, keep my job, make it through each day without falling apart. I didn't have room for anything else. And then I met you, and suddenly I had room for everything. Nolan, let me finish, please. He took a breath. You make me want to be better. Not perfect, because neither of us will ever be perfect, but better, braver, more willing to take risks on things that matter. And you've been so good to Ethan, so patient with him, so genuine. He loves you. I love you. And I know this is fast, and I know we're still figuring out how to make this work, but he pulled out the ring, and Sabrina's eyes went wide. Marry me, Nolan said. Not because it makes sense or because it's the logical next step. Marry me because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you make everything better just by being there. Because I want to build something real with you, something that lasts. For a long moment, Sabrina just stared at the ring, then at him, then back at the ring. Nolan felt his heart hammering against his ribs, terror and hope mixing into something that made it hard to breathe. You're serious, she said finally. Completely. We've only been together 8 months. I know. People will say we're moving too fast. Let them. She laughed, and it sounded wet. You're using my own logic against me. Is it working? Instead of answering, Sabrina stood up, walked around the table, and kissed him hard enough that he forgot they were in a public restaurant where people were definitely staring. When she pulled back, there were tears on her face. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Nolan slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly. They sat back down, ordered wine they barely touched, and talked about everything and nothing while the city lights sparkled beyond the window. Ethan's going to be impossible when he finds out he was right, Nolan said. He knew? Guessed. He's too observant. He gets that from you. Definitely gets it from me. They stayed at the restaurant longer than necessary, neither of them wanting the night to end. Eventually they left, walking through Seattle's streets hand in hand, talking about the future in a way that felt both terrifying and exactly right. I don't know how to do this, Sabrina admitted. Be a wife, be a stepmother, balance all of this with running a company. We'll figure it out. Same way we figured out everything else. By making it up as we go? Pretty much. She laughed and leaned into him. I'm glad it was you. That night, I mean. I'm glad Marcus and Claire set us up, even though it was a disaster. Best disaster of my life. Mine too. They ended up at Sabrina's apartment, talking until well past midnight about wedding plans and how to tell Ethan officially, and whether they wanted something big or small. Eventually, exhaustion won, and Nolan fell asleep on her couch with Sabrina curled against him, the ring on her finger catching the light from the city outside. The wedding was small, held at the youth center 6 months later. Ethan was the ring bearer and took his job with deadly seriousness. Keisha gave a speech about how Ms. Cole and Mr. Hayes had changed her life. Marcus served as best man and only made one joke about how the blind date from hell had turned into a marriage. Standing at the altar, watching Sabrina walk toward him, Nolan thought about all the moments that had led them here. The awkward dinner, the secret meetings, the investigation that had almost destroyed everything, the choice to stop hiding and face whatever came next. None of it had been easy. None of it had been smooth or perfect or anything like the story he'd imagined for his life. But it was real. And real, Nolan had learned, was worth more than perfect ever could be. You ready for this? Sabrina whispered when she reached him. Terrified, he admitted. Good. Me too. They said their vows in front of everyone who mattered, promising to love each other through complications and chaos, through workplace politics and single parenthood, through everything life decided to throw at them. And when they kissed, Ethan cheered loud enough that everyone laughed. Later, at the reception, Nolan found Sabrina standing by the window, looking out at the kids playing basketball in the center's gym. Thinking about something? Just how different my life looks now than it did a year ago. Better or worse? She turned to face him, and her smile was genuine. So much better it's not even close. No regrets? Oh, only that we didn't meet sooner. They danced to a song Ethan had picked out, something upbeat and slightly ridiculous that made everyone laugh. They cut a cake that Sabrina had insisted on making herself, and that turned out lopsided but delicious. They celebrated with people who doubted them, and people who'd supported them, and people who were just happy to see two broken people find a way to be whole together. And when the night finally ended, when they'd said goodbye to the last guests and cleaned up the mess and driven home to the life they were building together, Nolan lay in bed beside his wife and felt grateful for every messy, complicated, imperfect moment that had brought them here. "I love you," Sabrina said in the darkness. "I love you too. Even though I'm terrifying, especially because you're terrifying." She laughed and curled closer. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" "Yeah," Nolan said, and meant it. "We're going to be just fine." Because that's what happened when two people chose each other, even when choosing was hard, even when the odds were stacked against them, even when the whole world said it was a terrible idea. They built something real anyway, and real, in the end, was all that mattered. "I know you're not, but that doesn't mean I'm not scared." She wrapped her arms around him, and they stood like that in his tiny kitchen with dish soap still on their hands, and Ethan's laughter drifting in from the other room. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "I'm scared I'll mess this up, or that the company will force us to choose, or that I'll let you down when you need me most. But I'm more scared of not trying. We're a mess, you know that? The best kind of mess." They finished the dishes and joined Ethan in the living room for a movie that none of them really watched. Sabrina sat between Nolan and Ethan on the couch, and somewhere during the second act, Ethan fell asleep with his head on her shoulder. She looked down at him with an expression Nolan couldn't quite name, something tender and uncertain and hopeful all at once. "This okay?" she whispered. "More than okay." After they put Ethan to bed, Sabrina stayed for another hour. They talked about the company, about the youth center expansion they'd been planning, about nothing and everything. When she finally left, Nolan stood at the door and watched her drive away, feeling the kind of contentment he'd thought was gone from his life forever. The weeks that followed settled into something resembling normal, though normal looked different now than it had before. At work, Nolan and Sabrina maintained professional boundaries, different reporting structures, no favoritism, everything documented and above board. But outside the office, they built something that felt real. Dinner dates that didn't require secrecy. Weekend mornings at the youth center where they worked side by side. Evenings at Sabrina's place or his, learning how to fit their lives together in ways that weren't always smooth but felt worth the effort. The company gossip eventually died down, replaced by newer scandals and drama. Some people still looked at them sideways, still whispered about power dynamics and whether the relationship was appropriate. But most people moved on, because most people had their own lives to worry about. 3 months after the investigation ended, Sabrina presented a proposal to the board for a major expansion of the youth center. New programs, better equipment, scholarships for kids who showed exceptional promise. The funding would come partially from corporate donations and partially from Sabrina's personal wealth, which she'd been accumulating for years without knowing what to do with it. "This is what matters," she told Nolan after the board approved the proposal. "Not the quarterly earnings or the stock price. This. You're going soft on me, Ms. Cole. Don't let it get around. I have a reputation to maintain." They were standing in the newly renovated computer lab, watching Keisha help younger students debug their code. The girl had flourished over the past few months, her skills growing exponentially now that she had consistent access to equipment and mentorship. She'd already built 2 mobile apps and was working on a third that would help students track homework assignments. "She's going to do something incredible someday," Sabrina said. "She already is." You know what I mean. Nolan did know. He knew exactly what Sabrina meant, because he'd seen the same potential she saw. Not just in Keisha, but in all the kids who came through the center looking for something to believe in. And he knew that this, helping kids find their path, was what Sabrina had been missing from her life. All the success, all the money, all the corporate achievements meant nothing compared to seeing a 14-year-old girl realize she could build something that mattered. "Thank you," Nolan said. "For what?" "For being you, for caring about this, for not giving up when everything got hard." Sabrina laced her fingers through his. "You made it worth not giving up." 6 months after that disastrous blind date, Nolan stood in front of his bathroom mirror and tried to remember how to tie a decent knot in a tie. He'd gotten out of practice, relying too much on casual work attire and not enough on occasions that required looking put together. Tonight required put together. He'd made a reservation at the same restaurant where they'd first met, though this time there was no element of surprise. Sabrina knew exactly where they were going and why. He'd been not so subtly hinting at wanting to talk about something important for the past 2 weeks. Ethan appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his pajamas, even though it was barely 7. "You look nervous." "I'm not nervous." "You're lying. Your eye does that twitching thing when you lie." "Since when do you notice my eye twitching?" "Since always." "Are you going to ask Ms. Cole to marry you?" Nolan froze mid-knot. "What makes you think that?" "You've been acting weird, and you asked Grandma for Mom's ring last week. I heard you on the phone." There was no point in denying it. Ethan was too observant for his own good, and Nolan had never been particularly skilled at keeping secrets from his own kid. "Yeah, I'm going to ask her." "Good. She'll say yes." "How do you know?" "Because she looks at you the way you look at chocolate cake, like you're the best thing ever." Nolan laughed and pulled Ethan into a hug. "When did you get so smart about relationships?" "I watch a lot of TV while you're working." "That's not reassuring." Mrs. Chen arrived to watch Ethan, and Nolan drove to the restaurant with his heart doing uncomfortable things in his chest. The ring was in his pocket, a simple band that had belonged to his mother before Rachel had worn it briefly, and then left it behind when she disappeared. He'd had it cleaned and resized, and now it felt like it was burning a hole through his jacket. Sabrina was already there, sitting at a table by the window. The same table where they'd sat that first night, both of them horrified and trying to figure out how to escape without making things worse. "Hey," she said when he sat down. "Hey yourself. You look nervous. Your eyes twitching." She smiled, and it was the real smile. The one she saved for moments when her guard was down and she didn't have to be a CEO or a board member or anything other than herself. "What's going on, Nolan?" He could have done this the smooth way. Could have waited until after dinner, made some romantic speech, followed whatever script people used for these situations. But smooth had never been his style, and Sabrina deserved better than a performance. "I've been thinking about that first night," he said. "How we both wanted to run as soon as we saw each other. How we stayed anyway, because leaving would have been admitting defeat." "I remember. You told me about the youth center, about why you funded it, and I realized you weren't just some terrifying CEO. You were someone who actually gave a damn about things that mattered." "Where are you going with this?" Nolan reached across the table, took her hand. "I spent 2 years after Rachel left just trying to survive. Trying to be a good father, keep my job, make it through each day without falling apart. I didn't have room for anything else. And then I met you, and suddenly I had room for everything." "Nolan," "Let me finish. Please." He took a breath. "You make me want to be better. Not perfect, because neither of us will ever be perfect. But better, braver, more willing to take risks on things that matter. And you've been so good to Ethan, so patient with him, so genuine. He loves you. I love you. And I know this is fast, and I know we're still figuring out how to make this work, but..." He pulled out the ring, and Sabrina's eyes went wide. "Marry me," Nolan said, "not because it makes sense or because it's the logical next step. Marry me because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you make everything better just by being there. Because I want to build something real with you, something that lasts." For a long moment, Sabrina just stared at the ring. Then at him. Then back at the ring. Nolan felt his heart hammering against his ribs, terror and hope mixing into something that made it hard to breathe. "You're serious," she said finally. "Completely. We've only been together 8 months. I know. People will say we're moving too fast. Let them." She laughed, and it sounded wet. "You're using my own logic against me. Is it working?" Instead of answering, Sabrina stood up, walked around the table, and kissed him hard enough that he forgot they were in a public restaurant where people were definitely staring. When she pulled back, there were tears on her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Nolan slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly. They sat back down, ordered wine they barely touched, and talked about everything and nothing while the city lights sparkled beyond the window. "Ethan's going to be impossible when he finds out he was right," Nolan said. "He knew?" "Guessed. He's too observant. He gets that from you." "Definitely gets it from me. They stayed at the restaurant longer than necessary, neither of them wanting the night to end. Eventually, they left, walking through Seattle's streets hand in hand, talking about the future in a way that felt both terrifying and exactly right. I don't know how to do this, Sabrina admitted. Be a wife, be a stepmother, balance all of this with running a company. We'll figure it out, same way we figured out everything else. By making it up as we go? Pretty much. She laughed and leaned into him. I'm glad it was you. That night, I mean. I'm glad Marcus and Claire set us up, even though it was a disaster. Best disaster of my life. Mine too. They ended up at Sabrina's apartment, talking until well past midnight about wedding plans and how to tell Ethan officially and whether they wanted something big or small. Eventually, exhaustion won, and Nolan fell asleep on her couch with Sabrina curled against him, the ring on her finger catching the light from the city outside. The wedding was small, held at the youth center 6 months later. Ethan was the ring bearer and took his job with deadly seriousness. Keisha gave a speech about how Ms. Cole and Mr. Hayes had changed her life. Marcus served as best man and only made one joke about how the blind date from hell had turned into a marriage. Standing at the altar, watching Sabrina walk toward him, Nolan thought about all the moments that had led them here. The awkward dinner, the secret meetings, the investigation that had almost destroyed everything, the choice to stop hiding and face whatever came next. None of it had been easy. None of it had been smooth or perfect or anything like the story he'd imagined for his life. But it was real. And real, Nolan had learned, was worth more than perfect ever could be. You ready for this? Sabrina whispered when she reached him. Terrified, he admitted. Good. Me too. They said their vows in front of everyone who mattered, promising to love each other through complications and chaos, through workplace politics and single parenthood, through everything life decided to throw at them. And when they kissed, Ethan cheered loud enough that everyone laughed. Later at the reception, Nolan found Sabrina standing by the window, looking out at the kids playing basketball in the center's gym. Thinking about something? Just how different my life looks now than it did a year ago. Better or worse? She turned to face him, and her smile was genuine. So much better, it's not even close. No regrets? Only that we didn't meet sooner. They danced to a song Ethan had picked out, something upbeat and slightly ridiculous that made everyone laugh. They cut a cake that Sabrina had insisted on making herself, and that turned out lopsided but delicious. They celebrated with people who doubted them, and people who'd supported them, and people who were just happy to see two broken people find a way to be whole together. And when the night finally ended, when they'd said goodbye to the last guests and cleaned up the mess, and driven home to the life they were building together, Nolan lay in bed beside his wife and felt grateful for every messy, complicated, imperfect moment that had brought them here. I love you, Sabrina said in the darkness. I love you too. Even though I'm terrifying? Especially because you're terrifying. She laughed and curled closer. We're going to be okay, aren't we? Yeah, Nolan said, and meant it. We're going to be just fine. Because that's what happened when two people chose each other, even when choosing was hard, even when the odds were stacked against them, even when the whole world said it was a terrible idea. They built something real anyway, and real, in the end, was all that mattered.